You know what is happening right now across Australia that nobody is talking about? Rental prices are actually falling in some cities, not slowing down, not staying flat, actually dropping month after month. We have been conditioned over the last decade to think rent only ever goes up, that landlords have all the power and tenants have none, that renters are always scrambling, always desperate, always competing with 50 other applicants for every property, that vacancy rates are always under 1%, and you need to offer 6 months rent up front, plus references from 3 prime ministers just to be considered for a viewing. That has been the reality in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane for years. And the national conversation about rental markets has been dominated by that narrative. But the data from the last 12 to 18 months tells a completely different story in specific cities across Australia. And the rental market dynamics in these places are genuinely wild right now. Almost the exact opposite of what is happening in the capitals. In some Australian cities, landlords are panicking. Investment properties are sitting empty for 3 months, 6 months, sometimes longer. Asking prices are being slashed repeatedly, first by $20 per week, then $50, then $100. Landlords are offering incentives that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. First month free, reduced rent, flexible lease terms, no rent increases for 2 years, pet restrictions lifted, just to get any tenant in the door. Any tenant who can pay rent and will not trash the place. The power dynamic has completely flipped from landlord-dominated to tenant-dominated, and landlords who bought investment properties during the boom years are watching their retirement plans evaporate. Why is this happening? Multiple structural factors are converging simultaneously. Population decline in specific cities as industries contract and young people flee to the capitals for opportunities. Oversupply of rental properties built during the investment boom of the 2010s, when many people were buying property to negatively gear. The remote work revolution, allowing people to leave expensive cities without losing their jobs. Why pay $600 per week in Sydney when you can pay $300 in regional Queensland and do the same job? The cost of living crisis is pushing people to actively seek cheaper locations, rather than just accept high costs. International student numbers remain below pre-COVID levels in some cities. FIFO workers are leaving struggling mining towns as automation replaces jobs and mines scale back operations. The result? Rental markets that are genuinely in freefall in some places, with median rents dropping 20 to 30% in just 2 years. Properties that were getting $500 per week in 2022 are now listed at $350 and still not getting applicants. Landlords who were used to raising rent 10% annually without pushback are now facing the reality of negative rental growth while still paying mortgages, council rates, insurance, and maintenance. The negative gearing math that looked attractive when rents were rising looks disastrous when rents are falling and properties sit vacant. So I went deep into the actual rental market data, not the property investor propaganda. Real estate listings tracking median rent movements month by month. Vacancy rate statistics from SQM research showing which cities have excess supply. Domain and realestate.com.au quarterly rental reports showing price trends. Conversations with property managers in these cities about what is actually happening on the ground. The calls from desperate landlords. The properties sitting empty. The price drops they are recommending that landlords are refusing to accept until reality hits. About 7,000 Reddit and Facebook posts from renters who have recently moved to these cities from expensive capitals and are genuinely shocked at how cheap rent is and how much negotiating power they have. Stories of asking landlords to fix things and actually getting them fixed. Stories of negotiating rent down by $50 per week. Stories of landlords accepting lower rents just to avoid another month of vacancy. What I found is genuinely eye-opening if you are currently paying $600 per week for a shoebox apartment in Sydney, or $550 per week for a unit in Melbourne, or $500 per week for something tiny in Brisbane. These 10 cities have rental prices that seem impossible in 2026 Australia, where we are constantly told a rental crisis is everywhere and tenants have no options. We are talking 2-bedroom units between $250 and $350 per week in proper cities with services. Houses with actual yards for $400 per week. And not just cheap prices, negotiable prices because landlords are desperate for tenants and will accept less rather than eat another month of vacancy costs. Now, to be completely honest, some of these cities have problems. That is why rent is cheap. Markets work. Some are isolated, hours from major cities. Some have genuinely declining job markets as industries contract. Some have climate issues that make them hard to live in. Some have social problems. Some are just depressing places if you are used to city vibrancy. But if you can work remotely and your income is not tied to local employment, or if you are just genuinely sick of paying 50% of your income to a landlord in Sydney for the privilege of living in a city where you cannot afford to do anything anyway, these places deserve serious consideration. And yes, landlords in these cities are genuinely stressed. Their investment properties that were supposed to fund retirement are sitting empty, generating zero income while costs continue. Negative gearing only helps if you are actually getting rental income. When properties sit vacant, you are just losing money every single week with no tax benefits to offset it. They are having to sell at significant losses, accept tenants they would normally reject because of minor credit issues or lack of rental history, or drop prices to levels that destroy their investment returns. The tables have completely turned from the landlord-dominated market of from 2010 to 2020. Let's get into it, because number 3 is genuinely shocking, and number 1 is basically landlord panic in its purest form. At number 10, Gladstone, Queensland. This is a city where the rental market has completely collapsed. Population approximately 65,000. On the central Queensland coast, about 550 kilometers north of Brisbane, an industrial city built on aluminium, coal, and LNG. The median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $280. That is less than what some people pay for a parking space in Sydney. And we are not talking about a dump. These are standard, livable 2-bedroom units. 3-bedroom houses are going for $350 to $400 per week. Houses with yards and garages in suburbs that were charging $600 plus per week 5 years ago. What happened? The industrial boom ended. The LNG construction phase finished. The aluminium industry is struggling. The jobs that brought workers to Gladstone are disappearing or paying less. People are leaving faster than they are arriving. The vacancy rate in Gladstone is around 7 to 8%. That is insane. Anything over 3% is considered a tenant's market. At 7 to 8%, landlords are desperate. Property managers told me they have landlords calling weekly asking why their property has not been rented yet. They are having to explain that nobody wants to move to Gladstone right now, and the rental price needs to drop further to compete. Landlords who refuse to drop prices are watching properties sit empty for 6 to 9 months while they hemorrhage money on mortgages, rates, and maintenance. Here is the reality. Gladstone has problems. The industrial pollution is visible, the job market is contracting, the population is declining. But if you can work remotely and you just want cheap rent in a city with actual services, hospitals, shopping centers, and schools, Gladstone is absurdly affordable right now. You could rent a 3-bedroom house with a yard for $380 per week. That is $19,760 per year. On a $70,000 salary, that is 28% of your gross income. In Sydney, equivalent housing would be $700 plus per week, 50% of your income. The savings are massive if you can handle the industrial aesthetic and the contracting economy. Would you move somewhere industrial and declining for rent that is 40% cheaper? Some remote workers are saying yes. Number 9. Port Pirie, South Australia. An industrial city on the Spencer Gulf that has seen better days. Population is approximately 18,000. It is about 230 kilometers north of Adelaide, on the coast. Median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $230 per week. 3-bedroom houses rent from $280 to $320 per week. Port Pirie was built on lead smelting and grain handling. The lead smelter is still operating, but employment has declined. The town struggled with lead contamination issues that were addressed, but those issues damaged the town's reputation. Young families moved away. The population aged and declined. The rental market is in freefall. Vacancy rate is around 9%. Property managers have dozens of listings with no inquiries. Landlords are offering incentives. First month free, see reduced rent, and lifted pet restrictions. And they are still struggling to find tenants. Here is the reality. Port Pirie has serious reputation issues from its lead contamination history. The town is working to address and move past that. But perception lags reality. The industrial base is declining. Summers are hot, 38 degrees Celsius or higher regularly. It is not a beautiful place, but if you can work remotely and you want to save massive amounts of money on rent while living in a city with basic services, Port Pirie is absurdly cheap. A 3-bedroom house for $300 per week. That is $15,600 per year. On a $60,000 salary, that is 26% of gross income. You could save thousands per month compared to Adelaide or Melbourne. The trade-off is you are living in a struggling industrial town with a problematic history. For some people, particularly those focused on saving money aggressively, that is acceptable. Landlords are panicking because properties sit empty for months, and they are forced to accept lower and lower rents just to get someone in. At number 8, we have Whyalla, South Australia. A steel city in crisis, with rental prices to match. The population is approximately 22,000. Whyalla sits on the Spencer Gulf, about 380 kilometers northwest of Adelaide. Median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $240 per week. 3-bedroom houses rent for $300 to $350 per week. Whyalla was built on steelmaking. The steelworks have been through multiple crises, closures, and rescues. The industry is contracting. Jobs are disappearing. People are leaving. The rental market reflects this desperation. The vacancy rate is around 8%. Property managers say landlords are begging them to find tenants at any price because they cannot afford to keep properties empty. Some landlords have dropped asking rents by 30% in 2 years and still cannot find tenants. Properties that were renting for $450 per week in 2022 are now listed at $320 with no interest. Here is the brutal reality. Whyalla is in genuine economic decline. The steelworks are struggling. Young people are leaving for Adelaide or interstate. The population is aging and shrinking. Services are being cut. It is hot and isolated. But if you are a remote worker who just wants dirt cheap rent and does not care about economic vibrancy or social life, Whyalla offers extreme affordability. A 3-bedroom house for $320 per week. That is $16,640 per year. On a $70,000 remote work salary, you are spending less than 24% of gross income on housing. You could save more than $30,000 per year compared to living in Melbourne. The question is, can you handle living in a declining steel city with limited amenities and social opportunities? Some people can, especially if they are focused on short-term savings goals, paying off debt and building a deposit. Landlords are absolutely panicking. Their investment properties, bought during better economic times, are losing money every month. Some are selling at losses. Some are holding and bleeding cash. Some have stopped maintaining properties because they cannot afford to, with reduced rental income. The rental market in Whyalla is a genuine crisis for landlords who over-leveraged during the boom. Number 7. Kalgoorlie-Boulder, Western Australia. A mining city with boom-bust cycles and rental prices to match. Population approximately 32,000. Goldfields region, about 600 kilometers east of Perth. The median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $320. 3-bedroom houses rent for $400 to $450 per week. Wait, $320 does not sound that cheap. It was more than $800 during the mining boom. Rents in Kalgoorlie-Boulder have halved in some segments since the peak. Kalgoorlie-Boulder is entirely dependent on gold mining. When gold prices are up and mines are hiring, the city booms. When mining contracts, it busts. Right now, it is in a downturn phase with automation reducing employment and some mines scaling back. The vacancy rate has jumped to around 5%. Properties that were impossible to rent during boom times are now sitting empty. Landlords who bought investment properties from 2011 to 2013, expecting an endless boom, are now facing reality. Here is what makes Kalgoorlie interesting. Rental prices are relatively cheap now, but they could jump dramatically if mining picks up again. It is cyclical. If you are flexible and you do not mind the potential of having to move, when rents rise, you can save money during the bust phase. The city has actual services, including a hospital, schools, shopping centers, and entertainment. It is a real city, not a small town. The climate is hot and dry, but manageable. The isolation from Perth is significant, a 6-hour drive, but flights exist. For remote workers willing to live through the bust cycle, Kalgoorlie offers lower rent with proper city amenities, but you need to be aware that if mining booms again, rents could double within a year, and you would be priced out. Landlords right now are stressed because they are used to charging premium rents during booms. Being forced to accept $320 for a unit that got $600 5 years ago is psychologically difficult for them. Some are selling, some are holding and hoping mining picks up soon. The boom-bust cycle is brutal for everyone, but during the bust phase, tenants have the power. Number 6. Bundaberg, Queensland. Regional city with rental oversupply. Population approximately 70,000. It sits on the central Queensland coast, about 350 kilometers north of Brisbane. Median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $310. 3-bedroom houses rent for about $380 to $420 per week. These are cheap by Australian city standards. Bundaberg is a proper regional city with sugarcane, agriculture, and tourism, and it sits near the southern Great Barrier Reef. The economy is stable, neither booming nor collapsing. So why are rents so cheap? Oversupply. In the 2010s, developers built thousands of new apartments and units expecting population growth that did not materialize. Then the overseas student market collapsed during COVID and only partially recovered. The result is too many rental properties and not enough tenants. The vacancy rate in Bundaberg is around 4.5%. That is high enough that tenants have significant negotiating power. What makes Bundaberg interesting is that it is not a declining or struggling city. It is functional. It has a hospital, schools, shopping, entertainment, and beaches. The climate is subtropical, warm year-round. The lifestyle is decent, but there are just too many rental properties. Landlords are competing aggressively. Properties are sitting empty, and asking prices are being dropped repeatedly. For renters, this is fantastic. You can negotiate hard. You can request maintenance and upgrades as a condition of signing a lease. You can demand flexibility in lease terms. Landlords need tenants more than tenants need landlords. A 3-bedroom house near the beach can go for $400 per week. In Sydney, the equivalent would be $800 plus per week. In Brisbane, $650 plus per week. In Bundaberg, $400 per week, and often negotiable. The rental market dynamics heavily favor tenants right now, and landlords who refuse to accept this are watching properties sit empty. At number 5, we've got Rockhampton, Queensland, beef capital with surprising affordability. Population approximately 80,000. It sits in central Queensland, about 600 kilometers north of Brisbane. Median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $330. 3-bedroom houses rent from $400 to $450 per week. Rockhampton is a proper regional city. It is the service hub for central Queensland, with the beef industry, agriculture, mining services, education at CQ University campus, and healthcare. The economy is diverse and functional. So why is rent relatively cheap? Because Rockhampton is not trendy. It is not coastal, though it is near the coast. It gets very hot in summer, 35 degrees or more regularly with humidity. It is about 5 hours from Brisbane. It is just not on people's radar as a desirable place to live. But the rental market reflects this lack of demand. The vacancy rate is around 3.5%, not super high, but enough that tenants have options and negotiating power. Here's what makes Rockhampton work. It is a functional city with proper services, employment opportunities if you are not remote working, and amenities. It is not struggling or declining. It is just overlooked. For remote workers who can handle heat and isolation from Southeast Queensland, Rockhampton offers proper city living at regional prices. A 3-bedroom house with air conditioning for $420 per week. That is $21,840 per year. On a $75,000 salary, that is 29% of gross income. Very manageable. The climate is the main deterrent. Summer is genuinely oppressive, but if you are working remotely in air conditioning, you can handle it. Winter is beautiful, about 23 degrees and sunny. Landlords are not panicking like in some other cities, but they are definitely feeling pressure. Properties that would have rented immediately 5 years ago now sit for weeks. Landlords are having to offer better quality or lower prices to compete. Number 4. Townsville, Queensland, a defense city with rental market challenges. Population approximately 180,000. On the North Queensland coast, about 1,350 kilometers north of Brisbane. Median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $360 per week. 3-bedroom houses rent for $450 to $500 per week. Wait, that does not sound super cheap for a city of 180,000. It is cheap compared to what it was, and compared to equivalent cities elsewhere. Townsville had a huge rental boom driven by defense spending and mine construction. Rents skyrocketed. Then major construction phases finished, and defense spending stabilized rather than growing. The rental market softened significantly. Vacancy rate is around 3%, not crisis level, but enough that tenants have power. Here is what makes Townsville interesting. It is a real city. Proper infrastructure, a major hospital, a university, a defense base, shopping centers, entertainment, and beaches. It functions as a regional capital for North Queensland. The climate is tropical, hot and humid, but with an incredible dry season from May to October that is genuinely beautiful. The isolation from Brisbane is significant, but flights are regular. For remote workers who want proper city amenities at manageable rent, Townsville offers good value. You are not sacrificing city services for affordability. A 3-bedroom house in a decent suburb rents for $480 per week. That is $24,960 per year. In Brisbane, the equivalent would be $600 plus. In Sydney, it would be $800 plus. Landlords in Townsville are frustrated because they remember the boom times. Being forced to accept lower rents than they got 5 years ago is difficult, but the market has shifted, and they need to adjust or watch properties sit empty. At number 3, we have Darwin, Northern Territory. This one is genuinely shocking because we are talking about a capital city with capital city infrastructure. Population approximately 147,000. It is the capital of the Northern Territory, with all the government services and infrastructure that implies. Median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $400 per week. Wait, stop. Read that again. Darwin is a capital city with capital city cost of living in almost every category. Groceries are 25% more expensive than in southern cities. Fuel is pricier. Everything costs more. And yet rent for a standard 2-bedroom unit is $400 per week. The reason is that Darwin's rental market has absolutely collapsed from boom time heights, and the fall has been spectacular. To give context on how dramatic this shift has been, during the mining construction boom years, roughly 2010 to 2015, and the defense spending surge that followed, Darwin rents were insane. We are talking $800 plus per week for basic 2-bedroom units, $1,000 to $1,200 plus for ordinary 3-bedroom houses, $1,500 plus for anything decent. Landlords had complete and total power. Tenants were desperate, competing, offering above asking price, even offering rent up front for entire leases. People were living in caravans and hotel rooms because rental housing was impossible to find. Property investors watched Darwin and expected endless boom times. They bought investment properties at inflated prices with enormous mortgages, assuming rental income would keep climbing. They calculated returns based on peak rental prices that they believed would remain permanent. Then everything changed. The mining construction boom ended as projects completed, and construction workers left. The defense spending surge stabilized rather than continuing to grow. The transient population that had swollen Darwin departed rapidly. Many people left when contracts ended, tired of the oppressive heat, humidity, and isolation from family. International students did not return after COVID in previous numbers. Population growth reversed sharply. Now vacancy rate in Darwin is around 4 to 5%, which is extremely high for a capital city. Landlords are competing desperately for tenants. Properties sit empty for 2 months, 3 months, sometimes 6 months, while landlords hemorrhage money on mortgages, rates, insurance, and maintenance. 3-bedroom houses that were renting for $1,000 plus per week during boom times are now listed at $550 to $650 per week and are still sitting empty for months. Because even at those reduced prices, there are not enough people who want to live in Darwin to fill all the properties investors bought during the boom. Here is the Darwin situation in full context. It is a capital city with genuine capital city infrastructure and services. A major hospital with full emergency and specialist departments. Multiple shopping centers, entertainment venues, cinemas, restaurants, beaches. Everything you need from a city is present. The government sector provides stable employment. The defense sector is substantial. Services and amenities are real, but the climate is genuinely brutal for much of the year. The wet season from November to March is oppressively hot and humid, with constant 30 to 35 degrees and 80 to 90% humidity. Everything grows mold. The build-up period before the wet is almost unbearable. The isolation from the rest of Australia is extreme. 3,000 kilometers plus from the nearest major city means flights are expensive, and visiting family requires serious planning and cost. And beyond rent, the cost of living is genuinely very high because everything has to be transported long distances. Groceries are 25% more expensive. Building materials are expensive. Services are expensive. While rent has fallen dramatically, everything else remains expensive. But if you can work remotely for a Southern Australian salary, and you can tolerate or even enjoy the tropical climate and the isolation, Darwin offers something unique: capital city services, infrastructure, and amenities at regional city rental prices. A 2-bedroom unit with air conditioning and parking for $400 per week. That is $20,800 per year. On an $80,000 remote work salary, that is 26% of gross income. Extremely manageable. In Sydney, equivalent housing would be $650 plus per week, which is over 40% of that same income. The savings compound quickly. Over a year, you are saving $13,000 plus on rent alone. Add that you are earning a capital city salary while living in what are effectively regional prices for housing, and the financial benefits can be substantial for the right person in the right situation. Landlords in Darwin are absolutely, genuinely stressed, and many are in serious financial trouble. They bought properties during boom times, a $500,000 unit in 2013 that they financed with $450,000 borrowed. They were getting $900 per week in rental income, which covered the mortgage and costs with profit left over. The investment looked solid on paper with strong rental yields and capital growth expectations. Now that same property is worth maybe $450,000, a 10% loss in nominal terms and much more in real terms, and it is renting for $400 per week if they can find a tenant, which often takes 2 to 3 months of vacancy. The mortgage payment has not changed. They are still paying for the original $450,000 loan, plus interest. But the rental income has dropped by over 50%. They are losing money every single month, even with a tenant. And when it sits vacant, they are losing even more. Some are selling, taking losses, and walking away. Some are holding and bleeding cash, hoping Darwin booms again someday. Some have stopped maintaining properties adequately because they cannot afford to with the reduced income. Some are accepting lower rents just to get someone in to at least partially offset costs. The power dynamic has completely flipped from the boom years. Landlords who remember when tenants begged to rent their properties are now begging tenants to consider their listings. They are offering incentives, first month free, flexible lease terms, reduced rent for long-term leases, and waiving pet restrictions. Anything to get a tenant in. Would you live in Darwin's heat, humidity, and isolation for 50% lower rent than Brisbane while enjoying capital city amenities? Some remote workers are absolutely making that calculation and moving there specifically for the rental savings while earning southern salaries. Number 2, Broken Hill, New South Wales. A remote mining city where landlords are basically begging for tenants. Population is approximately 17,500. It is in far western New South Wales, about 1,150 kilometers from Sydney. Median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $180. 3-bedroom houses rent from $250 to $300 per week. Broken Hill's rental market has completely collapsed. The population is in freefall. The main mine is winding down. Young people are leaving. The population is aging and shrinking. Vacancy rate is probably around 10% or higher. No one is officially tracking it because it is so high it is embarrassing. Property managers say landlords will accept basically any tenant at any price just to get someone in. They have stopped doing proper reference checks. They are waiving bond requirements. They are offering months of free rent. The desperation is real. Here is the brutal reality. Broken Hill is dying. The mining industry that created it is ending. Services are being cut. The isolation is extreme. Adelaide is 500 kilometers away, and Sydney is 1,150 kilometers away. The climate is harsh, with scorching summers and freezing winters. There is no economic future for most young people, but if you are a remote worker who just needs internet and does not care about anything else, you could rent a house for $280 per week. That is $14,560 per year. On a $70,000 remote salary, you would be spending 21% of gross income on housing. You could save $40,000 plus per year compared to Sydney. The question is, can you handle living in a remote, dying mining town with limited services and social opportunities? Most people cannot, but for someone on a short-term savings mission, saving aggressively for 2 years to build a house deposit, it is mathematically compelling. Landlords in Broken Hill are utterly defeated. Their investment properties are basically worthless. They cannot sell them. They cannot rent them at break-even prices. They are trapped. This is what happens when a single town's industry dies, and landlords do not exit fast enough. At number 1, we have Port Augusta, South Australia, an industrial city in transition with a rental market in freefall. Population is approximately 14,500. It sits on the northern Spencer Gulf, about 300 kilometers north of Adelaide. Median weekly rent for a 2-bedroom unit is around $200 per week. 3-bedroom houses rent for $280 to $320 per week. Port Augusta was built on power generation, with coal-fired power stations. Those stations closed and the economy contracted. The population is declining, and young people are leaving. Vacancy rate is around 8 to 10%. Properties sit empty for 6 to 12 months. Landlords are absolutely desperate. I spoke with a property manager who said some landlords have given up. They are not even listing properties anymore because nobody wants to rent them. They are just letting them sit empty rather than face how low rents have fallen. Landlords who are listing are accepting rock-bottom prices. A 3-bedroom house with air conditioning, a yard, and a garage might be listed for $300 per week and still sit empty for months. Here is the Port Augusta situation. It is in genuine crisis. The town is trying to transition to renewable energy with solar thermal projects. But employment has not replaced what was lost. The population is declining, and services are being cut. The climate is brutal, with scorching hot summers, temperatures of 40 degrees or more regularly, cold winters, and dust storms. The isolation from Adelaide is significant. It is a struggling town in a harsh environment. But if you are a remote worker focused purely on savings, Port Augusta offers some of the lowest rent in Australia for a place with basic services. A 2-bedroom unit at $200 per week is $10,400 per year. On a $60,000 salary, that is 17% of gross income. You could live on $30,000 per year total in Port Augusta if you are frugal. Save $30,000 or more per year after tax. In 3 years, you could save a deposit for a house in a better location and leave. That is the calculation some young remote workers are making. Sacrifice 2 to 3 years in a harsh, struggling town to build a financial foundation. Landlords in Port Augusta are genuinely panicking. Properties that cost $200,000 to $300,000 to buy are renting for $250 per week. That is negative gearing on steroids, massive losses every single week, even after tax benefits. Some landlords are trying to sell, but there are no buyers. Some have walked away from mortgages. Some are holding and hoping something changes. This is landlord panic in its purest form. So there you have it, 10 Australian cities where rent is shockingly cheap and landlords are genuinely stressed. Are these glamorous places to live? No. Are they thriving economically? Mostly no. Are they isolated, harsh, or struggling? Yes. But they offer something increasingly rare in Australia. Genuinely affordable rent that leaves you with money for savings, debt repayment, or improved quality of life. The power dynamic between landlords and tenants has completely flipped in these cities. Landlords who were used to calling the shots and raising rent every year are now begging for tenants and accepting prices they never thought they would see. This is what happens when population declines, oversupply arrives, and economic conditions shift. The rental market is not a one-way street where landlords always win. For remote workers, for people willing to sacrifice location for savings, for anyone sick of paying 50% of their income to landlords in expensive cities, these places offer an alternative. It is not for everyone. It is probably not for most people. But for those who can make it work, the savings are massive and life-changing. And watching landlords panic after years of them having all the power, some tenants are finding that deeply satisfying. The Australian rental market is more complex and varied than the Sydney and Melbourne narrative suggests. There are places where tenants have power, where rent is negotiable, and where landlords are desperate. You just have to be willing to look beyond the obvious cities and accept specific trade-offs. If you made it this far, hit subscribe for housing market realities. Comment which of these cities shocked you most, or whether you would consider moving somewhere cheaper to save money. See you in the next one.